state is suddenly in the grip of lottery fever, and Springfield is no exception. In fact, every copy of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery has been checked out from the Springfield Public Library. Of course, the book does not contain any hints on how to win the lottery. It is rather a chilling tale of conformity gone mad. Oh.
Welcome to episode 30 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are continuing our Christmas season, where at least one of our movies will have a seasonal theme. This week, both films are directed by Robert Wise, a multiple Oscar-winning American director whose works have included The Body Snatcher, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Andromeda Strain, Star Trek the Motion Picture, West Side Story, and The Sound of Music, as well as this week's two movies. So first up, for our Christmas movie, we have The Curse of the Cat People from 1944, starring Simone Simon, Kent Smith, Elizabeth Russell, and Amy Carter. Another film in the series from RKO Studios and producer Val Lewton, this marked Wise's feature directing debut, though he did, in fact, share the directing credits with Gunther von Fritsch. Then we jump forward to 1963 and one of the most famous haunted house movies of all time, The Haunting. This was based on the novel The Haunting of Hill House, written by Shirley Jackson, and stars Julie Harris, Richard Johnson, Russ Tamblyn, and Claire Bloom. Along the way, we'll be discussing the career of Robert Wise, the career and writing of Shirley Jackson, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, though, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources that I've used in researching and preparing this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. And so, when discussing Curse of the Cat People, I have referenced the books Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror by Joel E. Siegel, and Icons of Grief, Val Lewton's Homefront Pictures by Alexander Nemerov. And when discussing The Haunting, I have mainly referenced the magazine Little Shop of Horrors, issue number 49. This has an insanely well-researched feature called The Roads to Hill House, the making of Robert Wise's The Haunting, and that's written by Anthony McKay. And if you are really interested in finding out every single detail of the film's production, I highly recommend it. As well as that, I've also referenced a website, thehaunting.com, that will be linked in the show notes. And for both movies, I have also referenced the IMDb, AFI, and Wikipedia pages for director Robert Wise, author Shirley Jackson, and both films. Robert Wise began his career as a sound and music editor at RKO Studios in the 1930s, and up to his death at the age of 91 in 2005, he worked as an editor, director, and producer across a wide range of genre, including science fiction, horror, musical, westerns, war movies, film noir, and drama. A four-time Oscar winner and recipient of a plethora of other awards, he was president of the Directors Guild of America between 1971 and 1975, and was also the president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences from 1985 through to 1988. And that's no small achievement for a man who made his featured directorial debut working in the horror unit at RKO Studios. He was born on the 10th of September 1914 in Indiana, and much like many of the other directors we've covered in the series, one of his favourite pastimes as a child was going to the movies. In high school, he wrote sports columns for the school's newspaper and was also a member of the yearbook staff and the poetry club, all of which pointed him towards a career in journalism. And this is something that he began following his high school graduation, when he won a scholarship to a small liberal arts college just outside of Indiana. But this period coincided with the Great Depression, and in 1933, due to the family's poor finances, instead of returning to college for his second year, he moved to Hollywood, where he began a lifelong career in the film industry. His older brother had already moved to Hollywood several years earlier and was working as an accountant at RKO Studios, and it was through him that the young Robert found a job working in the studio shipping room, lugging cans of film for about $25 a week, which would be worth approximately $530 a week today. As regular listeners will have gathered by now, the movie industry at that time was very, very different to the film industry today, and it was indeed a place where a young man with a hard-working attitude and attention to detail could find opportunities, and Robert Wise was no exception. He may have started in the shipping office, but he soon befriended the head sound effects editor, T.K. Wood, and ended up working as Wood's apprentice. After learning his craft, he was promoted to sound effects editor and impressed everyone around him with both his work ethic and his ability to learn quickly. And this beginning in sound effects and sound design is definitely worth remembering when we come to discuss The Haunting. Wise later said that, as he didn't have anywhere else to go, he would spend all of his spare time at the studios, watching the film editors at work in the cutting room. And after 4 years of working on sound editing, he finally moved into editing film content. Here he worked for RKO editor Billy Hamilton, who taught him a very disciplined and classical approach to film editing. And the lessons clearly paid off, as by the 1930s, Wise was working as an assistant editor on several high-profile projects, including the 1939 version of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, starring Charles Lawton, and My Favourite Wife, which was released in 1940 and starred Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. All of this soon brought him to the attention of Orson Welles, and in 1941 he worked as the editor on Citizen Kane, for which he earned himself an Oscar nomination. On this project, the studio gave him an assistant, a man called Mark Robson, who, much like Wise, would a few years later also end up working in the Val Lewton horror unit. As regular listeners will remember, Citizen Kane was not considered a success for RKO, and the studio was even less happy with Welles's follow-up, The Magnificent Ambersons. Insisting that the film be re-edited following what they considered to be disastrous previews, rather controversially, it was Robert Wise to whom they gave this task. He went on to say that recutting Welles's work was one of the most painful experiences of his professional life. He believed that he was knowingly diminishing a great movie, and at the same time was trying to save as much of Welles's work as the studio would allow. This happens very many times with an editor, he would say in later interviews. If there's a difference of opinion between the director or producer and the front office, the editor is going to find himself on the spot. But the editing work continued, and in 1943 he was hired to work as an editor on Curse of the Cat People, the direct sequel to the 1942 smash hit Cat People that we discussed back in episode 21. And so now we are getting into our first movie of the week, which is, of course, Curse of the Cat People. This was released in 1944 and stars Simone Simon, Kent Smith, Elizabeth Russell and Ann Carter. And with its carolers, snowstorms and presents under the tree, this is the Christmas aspect of this week's pairing. And now we are also about to get into the spoilers. So as always, if you haven't seen Curse of the Cat People, given that it's only just over an hour long, you might want to press pause, watch it, and then come back. As regular listeners will know, the creative dynamic between Val Lewton and RKO Studios was a rather interesting one. The studio would provide him with some fairly leery titles for his movies, and clearly expected him to make something that would live up, or perhaps that should be down, to their expectations. And then Lewton, who was interested in doing far more than just churning out low-budget horror potboilers, would try to find a way to work in something more meaningful than the studio had originally anticipated. This was certainly the approach that he had taken with Cat People, and it's fair to say that the follow-up was no different. Rather than give the studio the shape-shifting horror that they were no doubt hoping for, he instead provided an analysis of childhood loneliness and family relationships, and a film that would go on to be studied by child psychologists for years afterwards. Curse of the Cat People takes place several years after the events of the first film, and vanilla couple Oliver and Alice are now happily married and living in suburbia, or more specifically, Tarrytown, the home of Sleepy Hollow and its legendary Headless Horseman. We learn that Oliver and Alice now have a young daughter, Amy, a sensitive child who is subject to daydreaming and who has few actual friends as a result. Across the course of the film, Amy invents an imaginary friend to provide her with the love and affection that her parents seem unable to provide, and, inspired by seeing a photograph of Irina in an old album, imagines that her friend shares the same features. Although the screenplay is credited to regular screenwriter DeWitt Bodine, this is possibly Lewton's most personal work and incorporates many elements from his own childhood. Tarrytown was not far from the area in which Lewton himself was raised, and he too was a sensitive child who often retreated into fantasy. In the Joel E. Siegel book, Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror, the writer recounts that at least two of the events that occur in the film were based on Lewton's own life. As a child, he was once asked to mail the invitations for his sister's birthday party, and, much like Amy with her invites, placed them in what he believed to be a magical mailbox in the cleft of a tree. In addition, the maths lesson delivered by the ghostly Irina was the same way that Lewton taught his own children. The number 1 is a princess standing tall, the number 2 is a suitor down on one knee. It's also been suggested by more than one writer that the character of Julia Farren, the aging actress, was possibly inspired by Lewton's own aunt, with whom he lived as a child, a silent film actress called Alla Nazimova. The director was originally intended to be Mark Robson, who had worked as an assistant editor to Robert Wise on Citizen Kane and who had moved on to working in the Lewton Horror Unit. He directed The Seventh Victim and The Ghost Ship, both in 1943, and would also go on to direct Isle of the Dead, that we discussed back in episode 7. But Robson was still busy in post-production on The Ghost Ship, and so Lewton gave the opportunity to another first-time director, Gunther von Fritsch. Unfortunately, things didn't work out so well for him, and he was taken off the movie before it was half completed. The official line from the studio was that he had been drafted, but this was far from the actual truth, as Robert Wise recalled later. Quote, "Gunther wasn't drafted. The Curse of the Cat People was to be his first feature, and I was his editor. A shooting schedule was set up for 18 days, but he fell so far behind that after the 18 days were used up, he was still only halfway through the screenplay. Val tried to get Gunther to pick up the tempo, but it was his first big job, and he was just too nervous to move any faster. One Saturday morning, I got a call from Sid Rogel, who was then the head of the B unit. I had done some second unit work for Rogel and had been after him to let me direct. Rogel told me that I was to replace Gunther on Monday morning. Gunther and I had planned to do some extra night footage that very evening, and I knew that he had not yet been told of his dismissal. I couldn't bring myself to go to work with him under those conditions, and I called Val to ask his advice. "Look," he said, "if it's not you, it will be someone else. You're not pushing Gunther out." So I took over the picture on Monday morning and brought it in by early October. When I arrived on set that first day, Val gave me a copy of Shaw's The Art of Rehearsal, which I've kept with me ever since. End quote. And so that is how Robert Wise made his first step into directing, and it must be said that he acquits himself admirably. It's pretty much impossible to see where Gunther stopped and he began. Perhaps, though, this seamlessness is also due to the work of regular Lewton cinematographer Nicholas Mazuraka, who continued here the atmospheric cinematography that he had already demonstrated in Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Leopard Man, to name just a few. Using low-key lighting, he creates a world of shadows, but here the effect is much less harsh than in the earlier films, and is more in keeping with the themes of childhood fantasy and the idea of being seen and being hidden. Despite the replacement of director, the film was still completed 9 days behind schedule, and the studio had to recalculate the entire budget. This took it from roughly $147,000, which is $2.3 million today, to $212,000, which is roughly $4.1 million in today's money. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this made the studio executives rather nervous, and they began to insist on changes and additions. The scene near the beginning with the boys teasing a cat in a tree is a rather clumsy example of this, designed to show a connection between the first film and this one, but it's all a bit literal and really rather unnecessary. Another cut that the studio made, which is probably more impactful, is a scene early on in which Amy was supposed to be looking at a picture of Sleeping Beauty, dressed in a medieval gown. It is from this image and the picture of Irina that Amy constructs her imaginary friend, which goes a long way to explaining the flowing dress that Irina wears in the movie. Without this moment, which clearly shows that the figure is a figment of the child's imagination, we are left with a strange ambiguity as to whether Irina is a ghost or not, and also why the hell she is wearing that dress, and later the ermine robe as she sings in the garden. Lewton really wasn't interested in making a follow-up to Cat People, and tried, and failed, to convince RKO that the film should instead be called Amy and Her Friend, which is also a pretty lousy title, if we're honest. That being said, he did cast the stars of the earlier film, Simone Simon, Kent Smith and Jane Randolph, to repeat their roles of Oliver, Alice and Irina, which at least gave the studio the idea that they would be getting a sequel, even if they weren't really. And so in the movie, we learn that Oliver really hasn't improved with age, and still seems to possess all of the emotional intelligence of a lump of coal, although this is largely attributed to trauma, following the death of Irina at the end of the first movie. He describes Amy's imagination as morbid and sickly, framing it as lying and suggesting that his own daughter isn't normal. In response to this, her teacher, Miss Callahan, proposes a quite reasonable explanation, that the blame for this probably lies more with him than with his child, saying, quote, "Perhaps you are over-anxious, watch her too closely, worry too much. The child's bound to feel it." End quote. But true to character, Oliver ignores this idea and even goes so far as to suggest that Amy could almost be Irina's child. The fact that he says this to his now wife and Amy's actual mother is just one example of his lack of empathy, and his lack of sensitivity is compounded even further when he becomes angry at his daughter for not playing with the other children. He then dismisses her story about visiting the Farron house as a tall tale from her imagination, so his own bias and pig-headedness effectively pushes her further into the danger in which she finds herself later. "Now look," he says, "this is the last time you come to me with any such stories. I'm sick of this sort of thing, old dark houses and voices. Run out and play with the other children and never let me hear anything of that sort again. Your mother may excuse it as imagination, but I call it just plain lying, and I'll have none of it. You understand?" Charming. At this point, Alice interjects, resulting in a row in front of their daughter, with Oliver accusing her of spoiling Amy and Alice calling him unfair. Given this is the home situation, which is all pretty much caused by Oliver, it's hardly surprising that Amy seeks solace even further in her imagination and her fantasy friend. For the role of Amy, Lewton cast Anne Carter, who, despite being only 8 years old, had already appeared in several movies. Her first film role came after she was discovered at the age of 4 riding a bus in LA, and she made her screen debut in the 1941 Western. A year later, in 1942, she played Veronica Lake's daughter in the fantasy movie I Married a Witch, and at the age of 6, she appeared in her first major role in the wartime propaganda movie Commandos Strike at Dawn. But it is Curse of the Cat People for which she is best known, and she gives a remarkably good performance, something that was doubtless helped by the similarities between herself and the character. Both were only children, and Carter was, by her own admission in later interviews, also something of a daydreamer. To help shape her performance, her mother explained the entire plot to her so that she understood the full story, and this is something that Carter later credited with ensuring that she was not, quote, just some little parrot reciting lines, end quote. Despite the fact that she worked for 32 of the 33 days of filming and is the main focus of the movie, she claimed in later interviews that she felt no pressure and credited her parents with keeping her grounded and normal. She had nothing but positive memories of working on the production, describing it as fascinating because of the huge studio sets, which cycled through the seasons depicted in the movie. Autumn was created by stagehands throwing leaves from the catwalks above, while winter arrived courtesy of stagehands throwing gypsum and untouched cornflakes out of boxes to represent snow. But although she received very well-deserved and positive reviews for this film, her career never really flourished. She left acting at a very early age in 1948 after contracting polio, and although she recovered, she decided to move away into teaching instead of continuing her film career, a decision that she later said broke her mother's heart. She continued to teach and raise a family until she passed away in 2014, following a long battle with cancer. In 1991, Robert Wise described her performance as a great asset to his directorial debut, saying, quote, "I'm always struck by how good she is and how consistent her performance is throughout the film. Anne Carter just had one of those marvellous bits of chemistry for the screen that some actors have. She just clicked on the screen and that was it. She was very responsive and very quick." End quote. Although Alice does try to reason with Oliver, she is in her own way rather negligent of her child too. It is clear that both she and her husband have pretty much abdicated responsibility for raising Amy to their butler and cook, Edward, a problematic character for a modern audience, but one that no doubt reflected society of the time. Edward is played by Lancelot Pinard, who performed under the stage name Sir Lancelot. Born in Trinidad and the son of a wealthy government official, he moved to the US to study as a pharmacist. But after hearing a concert by the African-American tenor Roland Hayes, he abandoned this career and became a calypso singer. He made his stage debut singing at the Village Vanguard nightclub in New York and is now widely credited with popularizing calypso music in the US, cited as an influence by Harry Belafonte, among others. He moved into film work in 1942 when he was offered a minor singing role in a movie called Two Yanks in Trinidad from Columbia Studios, and this led to further parts, including 3 for Val Lewton, I Walked with a Zombie and The Ghost Ship in 1943, and this one, which would in fact be the last one that he made for the unit. Across the 1940s, he recorded numerous records and sang in commercials, and was also very politically active, writing and performing songs including Common Man, Walk in Peace, and Defenders of Stalingrad. His last film appearance was in 1958 when he starred with Yul Brynner in the movie The Buccaneer, and his music also served as the inspiration for the theme tune to the TV show Gilligan's Island. He continued to work as a musician until 1973, and briefly came out of retirement in the late 1980s to perform with Ry Cooder, among other musicians. He died of natural causes in Anaheim, California, in 2001. His character, Edward, clearly spends more time with Amy than her parents, and also feeds into her imagination, telling her that the ring that she has been given may be a wishing ring, leading her to then wish for her imaginary friend. That being said, though, even he isn't much better than the other adults in the movie, sending Amy off to the Farron's house to return the ring without even checking where she was going, and then admonishing her when she does exactly as he suggested. I think it's fair to say that the adults in the movie are deliberately a pretty lousy bunch, either wrapped up in guilt and regret like Oliver, their careers like Alice, or the housework like Edward, to pay much attention to the very lonely little girl that's sitting right under their nose. The only adult who really tries to understand Amy is her teacher, Miss Callahan, played by Eve March, though even she represents a scientific perspective as opposed to a genuinely loving one. Quoting books on child development, she, at the very least I suppose, tries to bridge the widening gulf between father and daughter, pointing out that Amy's behaviour is perfectly natural for a child of her age, and telling him that it's perfectly normal for a child to dream, saying, quote, "I can see how a sensitive little girl, finding this portrait, would take the image of this woman and make her an imaginary friend. That image was only in her imagination, and that image can go as quickly as it was born. Once the emptiness in Amy's life is filled, the dream will go of itself. It's up to you, both of you. Only you can bring her into the real world." End quote. Despite all this, though, the child-rearing ideas that she demonstrates in the film hardly make her seem enlightened to a modern audience. She tells Alice that it is best not to interfere when Oliver decides that Amy should be spanked, and follows this with the frankly laugh-out-loud line, quote, "After all, a first spanking, it's an important occasion." End quote. Across the town from the Reed household live another troubled family, Julia Farren and her daughter Barbara. They are set up in contrast to the Reed family of Oliver, Alice and Amy, and almost serve as a warning of what families may become if due care is not taken. Julia Farren, once a great actress and now suffering from dementia, no longer recognises her daughter, going so far as to say that her daughter died as a child, and that, quote, "The woman who takes care of me is an imposter, a liar, and a cheat." End quote. The juxtaposition of the two families was always intended to have more resonance. In the original script, Julia Farren was supposed to have quoted lines from Shakespeare's King Lear, a play which is all about a parent's inability to know who their children really are. Sadly, though, this line was cut, which is a real shame as it would have underscored the central theme of the movie. Its inclusion would also have linked the two stories more closely and emphasised the fact that Oliver is unable to see who his daughter really is, while Julia Farren, quite literally, does not see her daughter at all. Julia Farren is played by Julia Dean, an actress who, like Lewton's Aunt Alla, began her career in the silent era. She has some of the best moments in the film. Her recital of the legend of Sleepy Hollow is suitably melodramatic. Her face is lit from beneath as she delivers her monologue directly to camera, and it's really quite something to behold, even if it is entirely inappropriate for her young audience. And here too is another beautifully realised moment from the young Anne Carter. The camera slowly zooms in on her terrified face as her eyes widen and the story reaches its climax. No wonder that the performance stays with her in the way it does, creating a brilliant moment later in the film when Amy mistakes the sound of an oncoming car for the hoofbeats of the Headless Horseman coming to take her away. In the role of Barbara Farren, Lewton cast another regular collaborator, though one who had more often than not appeared in memorable bit parts rather than in major roles. This is the actress Elizabeth Russell, who here, happily, is given much more to do than usual. Barbara is rejected by her mother and is taking out her hostility on the world, and more importantly, on Amy. We spoke of Russell briefly when we discussed her cameo role in 1942's Cat People, and as I said at the time, I've always thought it was a shame that she didn't have a much bigger career. Her face is perfect for film noir, and she manages to instill Barbara with both tragedy and menace. "You haven't even opened my gift, and I'm your daughter," she says sadly, her suffering and bitterness later further emphasised by the line, "Even my mother's last moments you've stolen from me." Interestingly, though, this final scene with Barbara softening was originally conceived very differently. In an early draft, the figure of Irina was presented far more explicitly as a ghost, and was in fact going to save Amy from the drunken Barbara by locking the older woman in the basement. Ultimately, this was changed to the ending that we see today, with Irina positioned as a more imaginary figure, but it must be said that at times the script seems to want it both ways. For example, there is absolutely no explanation given for how Amy learns the Serbian lullaby that served as Irina's theme in the first movie. It's been suggested that the earlier iterations of the screenplay leaned far more heavily into a traditional ghost story, and this was to secure studio approval. So perhaps this is a hangover from that approach, but it does leave things a little bit confusing. Had the character of Irina been conceived as a full apparition, Simone Simon might perhaps have been given a little bit more to do, but sadly this is not the case. Given the complexity of her performance in the first movie, it's a shame that here she is reduced to a far more one-dimensional figure, though she remains an undeniable screen presence, most notably in the scenes where she stands in the snow towards the end of the picture like a figure out of a storybook. On its release in 1944, the press reception was rather mixed, which is probably not surprising given the wildly misjudged marketing campaign created by the studio. Using taglines that included "The Black Menace Strikes Again" or "Sensational Return of the Killer Catwoman," they thuddingly emphasised the B-movie nature of the title rather than the film itself, and it's quite hard to imagine that anyone in the publicity department saw the finished film at all, which, quite possibly, they didn't. Suggestions were even made to theatre owners that they should stencil paw prints leading to the theatre, or even send out small groups of men and women wearing cat masks to walk through the streets. No wonder then that some critics and audience members were rather confused by the end result. Variety dismissed the film as disappointing and called it a failure as a sequel, and other reviewers commented on the discrepancy between the rather lurid promises of the title and the much quieter and more thoughtful film that was actually projected onto the screen. But fortunately, these were not the only voices. The New York Times called it a rare departure from the ordinary run of horror films, saying that it emerged as an oddly touching study of the workings of a sensitive child. Critic James Agee also praised the film as a brave and sensitive psychological drama, famously saying that it, quote, captured the poetry and danger of childhood, end quote. And the New York Times and James Agee were not alone in their appraisals. On the 7th of September 1944, The Curse of the Cat People was used as the highlight of a seminar devoted to the treatment of children in films. Shortly after this, the film was exhibited at the Child Psychology Center at UCLA, and its depiction of childhood loneliness and isolation continued to be used as a reference in child psychology courses and also by parent-teacher associations. Since its release, on a creative level, it's also gone on to be compared favourably with the works of Jean Cocteau for its fusion of reality and fairy tale, something that the director Joe Dante has called, quote-unquote, disturbingly Disney-esque. After Curse of the Cat People, Wise would direct 2 more movies for Val Lewton. His first solo directing work would come with Mademoiselle Fifi, released in 1944 and also starring Simone Simon. This was a period drama as opposed to a horror film and was not as well received as Lewton's more usual horror output. As if in response, in 1945, Lewton and Wise released The Body Snatcher, which starred Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and was based on a short story by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was a huge commercial and critical success, and I have no doubt we'll talk about it in more detail at some point next year, as I think it's now inevitable we're going to cover all of the Lewton horror films at some point in the series. Wise then moved on to direct film noir, including Born to Kill in 1947 and Blood on the Moon in 1948, and then moved into the world of boxing for his final RKO movie, The Setup, which earned the Critics' Prize at the Cannes Film Festival. And then, in 1951, he directed The Day the Earth Stood Still for 20th Century Fox, a classic science fiction movie starring Michael Rennie, Patricia Neal and Hugh Marlowe. This tells the story of a flying saucer that lands in Washington, which is quickly surrounded by soldiers and tanks. When a humanoid alien emerges, announcing that he has come in peace and with goodwill, he is shot and wounded by a soldier, causing retaliation from a large robot called Gort. It's a quite brilliant movie and definitely worth watching if you have the opportunity, though I'm sure that some modern viewers would be up in arms over its political messaging and would doubtless describe it as, God help us, woke. Through the 1950s, he directed across a wide range of genre, including Paul Newman in the 1956 boxing drama Somebody Up There Likes Me, and in 1958 the biography of convicted murderer and sex worker Barbara Graham in the movie I Want to Live. Despite its highly controversial narrative, and also questions as to how much of it was actually real and how much of it was fiction, it is a damning indictment of capital punishment, and earned actress Susan Hayward an Oscar, and also earned Wise his first nomination for Best Director. He would win his first directing Oscar in 1961, albeit a joint win with co-director Jerome Robbins for their musical West Side Story, which Wise also produced. This film would go on to win 10 Academy Awards overall, and is widely recognised as one of the greatest musicals ever made, as well as being the highest-grossing film of 1961. And with multiple awards and nominations under his belt and a move into musicals, one could have been forgiven for assuming that his days as a horror director were far behind him. However, this was far from being the case. At the end of the 1950s, while in pre-production for West Side Story, he came across a review in Time magazine of the new novel by the writer Shirley Jackson, and that novel was The Haunting of Hill House. Shirley Jackson was born in December 1916 in San Francisco, California, and was raised in an affluent suburb of the city. By all accounts, her relationship with her mother Geraldine was rather difficult. Her parents had married young, and Geraldine had been somewhat disappointed when she immediately became pregnant with Shirley. A solitary child, the young Shirley was unable to fit in with other children in the neighbourhood and spent much of her time writing, something of which Geraldine did not particularly approve. Shirley's younger brother Barry, who quickly became their mother's favourite, explained later that their mother was, quote, a deeply conventional woman who was horrified by the idea that her daughter was not going to be deeply conventional, end quote. This upbringing, plus challenges with her own self-image and fluctuating weight, resulted in a lack of confidence with which she would struggle throughout her life. During her senior year of high school, the family relocated to Rochester in New York, and Shirley initially attended the University of Rochester, where her parents felt that they could maintain supervision over her studies. However, she was incredibly unhappy in her classes there and took a year-long sabbatical from her studies before transferring to Syracuse University to study journalism. While there, she became involved with the campus literary magazine, which published her first story, called Janice, about the suicide attempt of a teenager. It was also here that she met her future husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, who she married shortly after graduating in 1940. After moving several times, the pair settled in North Bennington, Vermont, where Shirley had been hired as an instructor at Bennington College, and this college later became the educational home of celebrated novelist Donna Tartt, author of The Secret History and The Goldfinch. In an introduction to a 1996 collection of Jackson's novels and stories, Tartt describes Bennington College and the town as being haunted, calling it, quote, a power spot, a place where unknown energies of natural or supernatural origin have for some reason converged, end quote. She then goes even further and describes several houses in the town as being leprous, saying, quote, there is the Jennings Mansion, from whose empty attic a kind of ethereal music, having no known source, was said occasionally to emanate, and where the students in my day used to dare each other to spend the night. So far as I know, no one ever did. Stokes House, famous for its suicides. Lee House, where the furniture was said sometimes to move by itself, and where I was once struck motionless with terror at finding myself surrounded by a clatter of invisible footsteps, perfectly audible to both my friend and myself, circling very close about us in an otherwise deserted hallway. There is the Park McCullough House, which a friend who worked there refused to even discuss, and the President's House, by all accounts, the worst of them all. End quote. I have no idea at all whether Bennington is indeed a haunted town, and if there are any listeners from the region, I would be very interested if you were to write in and share your stories. But given these surroundings, it's perhaps not surprising that Jackson herself had a clear interest in witchcraft and the supernatural, writing, quote, "Most people have never seen a ghost and neither want or expect to. But almost everyone will admit that sometimes they have a sneaking feeling that they could just possibly meet a ghost if they weren't careful. If they were to turn a corner too suddenly, perhaps, or open their eyes too soon when they wake up at night, or go into a dark room without hesitating first." End quote. Once in Bennington, Jackson began writing new material as Stanley established himself as a literary critic. Both were enthusiastic readers and had a personal library that was estimated at over 25,000 books, and they were also known for being colourful and generous hosts who surrounded themselves with literary talents. Sadly, though, the marriage was not a particularly happy one for Shirley. Hyman was often unfaithful, particularly with his students, and when he proposed an open relationship, Shirley reluctantly agreed. He also had strict control over their finances, and this was despite the fact that as she became more successful, Shirley was the main breadwinner in the household. In 1948, she published her debut novel, The Road Through the Wall, which is a semi-autobiographical account of a child growing up in California. However, it was in June of the same year that she published what is possibly her most famous short story, one which earned her considerable reputation and also a not insignificant amount of fury from the readers of the New Yorker magazine. And this story was The Lottery. I am not going to give any spoilers at all for this story, other than to say it is absolutely fantastic, and if you've never read it, please do try to track it down. It's fair to say that its publication drew outrage, which surprised both Jackson and the New Yorker magazine itself. Subscriptions to the magazine were cancelled, and huge amounts of hate mail was sent throughout the summer of 1948. Jackson herself claimed to receive at least 10 angry letters per day. This was the most mail that the magazine had ever received for a work of fiction, and Jackson later commented on this in a lecture that she gave in 1960, saying, quote, "One of the most terrifying aspects of publishing stories and books is the realization that they are going to be read, and read by strangers. I had never fully realized this before. I had, of course, in my imagination, lovingly dwelt upon the thoughts of the millions and millions of people who were going to be uplifted and enriched and delighted by the stories that I wrote. It had simply never occurred to me that these millions and millions of people might be so far from being uplifted that they would sit down and write me letters. I was downright scared to open over 300-odd letters that I received that summer. I can count only 13 that spoke kindly to me, and they were mostly from friends." End quote. Given this, I'm sure it comes as no surprise that her mother Geraldine was not a fan of the story, writing to say, quote, "Dad and I did not care at all for your story. It does seem, dear, that this gloomy kind of story is what all you young people think about these days. Why don't you write something to cheer people up?" End quote. But regardless of her mother's opinion and the reception at the time, the story The Lottery has gone on to be recognised as a classic and has also been adapted for radio, television and a 1953 ballet. There were also films in 1969 and 1997, a TV movie, an opera, a one-act play, and of course it's also been parodied by The Simpsons. Despite the quality of several of these adaptations, I would strongly recommend tracking down the source material itself, as Jackson's prose, which is lean and elegant, is really quite something to experience. Despite the controversy, the story was published again in 1949, when it appeared in a collection titled The Lottery and Other Stories. She continued to write stories that were published in magazines across the country, and despite her mother's request, she certainly did not go on to write something to cheer people up. In 1950, Charm magazine published what is possibly my favourite of her short stories, titled The Summer People. This tells the story of an elderly couple who decide to stay at their lakeside holiday home beyond Labor Day, something that none of the other summer people have ever done. Although objectively you could argue that nothing really happens in the story, it is a masterclass of mounting menace and tension, exploring themes of xenophobia, the outsider, tradition, rural hostility, and the violence that lurks beneath the surface of seemingly idyllic country life. These themes also emerge in the movie The Haunting, where Dudley the caretaker, played by Valentine Dyall, is openly hostile to Eleanor, played by Julie Harris, when she first arrives at Hill House, saying, quote, "You think we can't have things the way we want, me and the wife, as long as we stay around here, looking after the house. For all you city people, you think you know everything." End quote. And it's just my opinion, but I believe that the story The Summer People has served as the inspiration for many a Stephen King short story, though admittedly his tend to be far more explicit and violent. Anyway, if you like folk horror and a creeping slow burn, I highly recommend it. A year later, in 1951, she published her second novel, titled Hangs a Man, which tells the story of a lonely college freshman called Natalie Waite, who descends into madness. She followed this with more short stories and 2 more novels. The Bird's Nest, published in 1954, concerned a young woman with dissociative identity disorder, and 1958's The Sundial was about a family of eccentrics who believe that the end of the world is shortly to come upon them. But it is perhaps her 5th novel for which she is now best remembered, and this is, of course, The Haunting of Hill House, which was published in 1959. And now we are getting into the spoilers for both the novel and the film, so if you've yet to experience either, it's that time in the show where you're better off pressing pause and coming back once you have. The inspiration for the story came when Shirley was reading about a group of 19th century psychic investigators who were researching a supposedly haunted house. She reportedly found their accounts of the investigations to be rather dry, but she discovered within them a far more interesting tale than just one of a plain haunting. She described it as, quote, "not the story of a haunted house. It was the story of several earnest, misguided, certainly determined people with their differing motivations and backgrounds." End quote. The stories behind the inspiration for the house itself are somewhat confusing, and suggests that they are perhaps coloured by Jackson's need to tell a good story rather than historical accuracy. One account suggests that she came across a photograph in a magazine of a suitably haunted-looking house, and, on researching it, discovered it had been designed by her own great-great-grandfather. Another story tells that it came about in 1958 during a train journey to New York, where she was due to meet with her agent and a new publisher. As the train pulled into the station, she caught sight of a house that she described as the most hideous building that she had ever seen. By all accounts, it had such a strong impact on her that she changed her ticket home to a night train so that she would not be forced to look at it when leaving the station, though, to be fair, she could have just faced the other way. Regardless of which version you believe, and as Jackson was a writer, both of them are possibly exaggerated, she began researching her next novel, provisionally titled The Haunted House, and started reading about supposed real hauntings. These included Borley Rectory, which was once reputed to be the most haunted house in England, and on which the interior of Hill House was based. She also read various newspaper accounts of poltergeist activity, and I think it's fair to say that this inspired the backstory given to Eleanor, who is chosen to assist in the investigation because of an incident from her childhood. It is alleged that for several days stones fell on her home when she was a child, and the phenomena only stopped once Eleanor was temporarily moved. This is also remarkably similar to something that happens in Stephen King's novel Carrie, where a rain of stones falls from the skies when Carrie is a small child. And given the praise that King lavishes upon the novel in his book Danse Macabre, it would not be remotely shocking to find out that this was a deliberate Easter egg for the eagle-eyed reader. The Haunting of Hill House tells the story of a group of people led by Dr. John Montague, who are invited to spend a summer at the titular Hill House to investigate its supposed haunting. Aside from Dr. Montague, the guests are Eleanor Vance, the protagonist, and a shy young woman who has been caring for an invalid mother, and who has been invited due to the Rain of Stones incident from her childhood. Joining her are Theodora, an artist and a psychic, and Luke Sanderson, the heir to the Hill House estate. Soon after arriving, the guests start to experience strange phenomena. Writing appears on the walls, noises are heard late at night, and a ghostly family is seen having tea on the lawn. All of this, though, is described in a deliberately vague manner, and it is implied that some, but certainly not all, of the events might be in Eleanor's imagination. The reason that I say not all is because events are indeed witnessed by others, though when Dr. Montague's wife and her companion arrive to investigate, they witness absolutely nothing at all. As the story progresses, it is implied that Eleanor is the root of the hauntings, possibly through telekinesis, or perhaps she acts as a form of battery for the ghosts in the house. Either way, it is decided that she should leave. However, the house, or perhaps Eleanor herself, has very different ideas. The finished manuscript was completed in the spring of 1959, and the novel was published in October and was reviewed by Time magazine. It was this review that caught the attention of Robert Wise, and I thought I would read it to you here, by way of a further plot summary, and also so you can see what caught his attention. Unmarried at 32, Eleanor Vance has spent the past 11 years of her life caring for a sick mother whom she hated. Now Mama has died, Eleanor is living with a dull married sister, and her experience of life is a dreary vacuum. It is almost like liberation when Dr. Montague takes her on as one of 3 assistants to check psychic phenomena at a haunted house in a grubby small town. Author Jackson, a self-confessed dabbler in magic, sets her scenes with professional care. The big old house is a crazily built warren of old rooms and twisting corridors. For 80 years, it has witnessed a variety of human disasters, and now it is deserted by its owners. The caretaking couple refuse to stay beyond 6 in the evening, and the townspeople go surly when it is even mentioned. The climate of horror develops soon enough. There are unearthly night noises. A ghostly hand scrawls, "Help, Eleanor, come home," and some force or creature smears blood, or is it red paint, over the clothes of another of the doctor's girl assistants. Eleanor begins to crack soon enough. Her whole personality begins to disintegrate, and fantasy takes over from reality. She awakens at night to the call of her dead mother. All too soon, it becomes obvious that Mama is the real couch history villain, and that Eleanor never really had a chance. Within a week, Eleanor is thinking of the haunted house as a refuge from her hated life. She gradually gives up her fears, her fight for sanity, and puts out welcoming arms to the madness that embraces her. She dances through the house like a dervish at night, comes close to what seems a happy suicide. By this time, Dr. Montague and the others insist on sending her home, and Eleanor's life ends in one of those terrible scenes of mental horror that author Jackson knows so well how to contrive. The difficulty is that the story is itself caught in a straitjacket fashioned by the lines of case history. Expert as it is, The Haunting of Hill House is also haunted by too many other novels that owe their life to the father of psychoanalysis. End quote. And as you've just heard, it's probably not the most favourable review, but to Wise the summary sounded perfect for a movie, which, to be fair, it really does. He contacted the publisher to see if the rights were available, and on discovering that they were, he bought a copy of the book at a local bookstore and started reading it in his office. And while reading the book, he was interrupted by friend and colleague, the screenwriter Nelson Gidding, who had written the screenplay for I Want to Live, and with whom Wise had set up a new production company. According to reports, Gidding burst into the room just at the point that Wise was reading one of the novel's more hair-raising sequences, and the director was so scared by the interruption that he quite literally jumped from his seat. Realising that the novel had an incredibly strong effect on him, he became convinced that it was ripe for film adaptation, and the rights were purchased for $67,500, which would be the equivalent of about $751,000 today. He gave the book to Gidding and asked him to start working on the screenplay, while he began production on West Side Story. The screenplay is relatively faithful to the original novel, certainly far more so than the 2018 Mike Flanagan miniseries, but there are some changes made. Character names are different. The background to the haunting also has differences. There is a haunting on the lawn in the book, and in the movie they barely leave the house, and there are several other changes too. But perhaps the most notable difference is in subtext, and this came courtesy of screenwriter Gidding. Once he had completed his first draft, he was struck by an unusual idea, and one that would go on to explain the ambiguity of the film. Instead of a conventional ghost story, he began to believe that the haunting of Hill House was a metaphor about a woman who'd had a nervous breakdown and who had been institutionalized, saying, quote, "The haunted house is actually the institution, the sanatorium, where she is a patient. And Markway, the head of the experiment in the haunted house, is actually her doctor. Theo was her nurse, and Eleanor is a patient. I did quite a bit of research once I had this idea. A cold spot is shock treatment. I understand that when you undergo shock treatment, you feel cold, very cold afterwards. And of course, the violence of the shock treatment itself is the noise and the banging of the haunted house. And people will always be opening and closing doors because it was a locked institution. It worked perfectly. I could give you chapter and verse. I had a very good case for it. We had written a ghost story, and it was supposed to be that, and we weren't going to change it drastically, but we figured that this might be the real meaning." End quote. This, of course, is not the story that Shirley Jackson wrote at all, and when Wise and Gidding spoke to her about their interpretation, she confirmed that yes, it was a very good idea, but her novel was a ghost story, pure and simple. Nevertheless, knowing this does give the finished film an additional resonance, and also reaches back to the 1920 movie The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which uses a similar plot device. Personally, for me, I like the ghost story, but the beauty of the haunting, and perhaps the reason for its longevity, is that it can be read in multiple ways, so if you want to watch the film with this interpretation in mind, then you certainly can. Given his background working for Val Lewton, it's not a surprise that the ambiguous approach appealed to Robert Wise's creative sensibilities, and there is a clear through line from the quiet horrors of the RKO unit to this movie. Lewton, as regular listeners will remember, believed that people are more afraid of the unknown than of what they actually see, and this is an ethic that Wise brought with him to the film. In fact, the movie is very much a tribute to the Lewton School of Filmmaking, which is also why it was filmed in black and white, something that Wise had written into the contract. And just as well that he did. At one stage, the film was going to be colorized by the studio, and Wise had to point out the clause in the contract to ensure that this did not happen. We never really see whatever is haunting the house, if there is indeed a ghost at all, but we certainly hear something. In the movie, the manifestations come through a truly phenomenal use of sound, and this reflects Wise's origins as a sound editor. These soundscapes come courtesy of dubbing editor Alan Soanes, as well as uncredited work by Desmond Briscoe, the head of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop that we talked about back in episode 3. And I think it's fair to say that the sound design has certainly influenced many later films, including The Changeling in 1980 and The Orphanage from 2007. Some of the sounds were created with a deliberately low-frequency bass, which causes a physical sensation when played at loud volume. And the banging and splintering, as something makes its way along the corridors, is truly spectacular. And very significantly, the soundtrack was not something that was just added in the editing suite. The sound team created a cacophony of voices and noises before filming began, and these were played back during the shoot, something which Wise says greatly enhanced the acting performances. Quote, "We had all those sound effects that the actors had to react to. Usually, a prop man will make a noise off camera. I knew it was too important, so I pre-scored all of these sound effects and voiceovers before I started shooting. I had a big speaker off camera for them to work with. This helped me get the honest reactions I needed to make the scene work." End quote. Many of these sounds were created and recorded in an empty manor house and still remain in the finished product, so some of the sounds that we hear in the final movie are just as the actors heard them during filming. For example, the distorted and muffled giggles and voices as Eleanor believes she is holding Theo's hand in the night. The atmosphere is also greatly enhanced by the cinematography, most notably through the choice to shoot with a Panavision camera, which deliberately distorted the image. This makes the interiors of the house seem deliberately off-kilter, which, as we discover, they indeed are. Close-ups of wallpaper hint at hidden faces, as we hear giggling and voices in the background, and more than once we are tricked through false perspectives. And of course there is the quite spectacular shot of a doorway bulging inwards, an effect created by a member of the crew pushing timber against the back of a laminated wooden door. Stephen King comments on this effect and the overall approach to the film in his book Danse Macabre, saying, quote, "The interesting thing lies in the fact that we never actually see whatever it is that haunts Hill House. Something is there, all right. Something holds hands with the terrified Eleanor in the night. She thinks it's Theo, but finds out the next day that Theo hasn't even been close to her. Something knocks on the wall with a sound like cannon fire. And this same something causes the door to bulge testily inwards until it looks like a giant convex bubble, a sight so unusual to the eye that the mind reacts with horror. In a very real way, in spite of the fine acting, fine direction, and the marvellous black and white photography of Davis Bolton, what we have in the film is one of the world's few radio horror movies. Something is scratching at the ornate panelled door, something horrible. But it is a door that Wise elects never to open." End quote. And this is certainly more than can be said for the absolutely god-awful 1999 remake, in which director Jan de Bont overdoes the CGI to such an extent that it becomes impossible to take seriously, despite the fine performance from Lily Taylor in the role of Eleanor. Wise's film is full of striking images, captured by split diopter shots and an incredibly mobile camera which runs up and down door frames and shakily pans backwards as Theo tells Eleanor that the house is calling for her. There is also an incredibly effective use of infrared film to capture more nightmarish textures, particularly in the opening shots of the house, dark against the sky as the credits appear in stark white, accompanied by the ominous score from composer Humphrey Searle. The opening credits are soon followed by the history of the house, including the first shot of the spiral staircase as the companion hangs herself, followed by a dizzying high-speed descent back down the steps. The infrared is used again when Eleanor sees the house for the first time, and we then see her viewed from high at the top of the building, tiny and helpless as she emerges from her car, the house towering above her. This perspective nicely foreshadows Eleanor's interior monologue after she has been left by the frankly terrifying Mrs. Dudley, saying, quote, "I'm like a small creature, swallowed whole by a monster, and the monster feels my tiny movements inside." End quote. Pre-production was a long process, partly because of the filming of West Side Story and also because of financing issues and a shift from the original studio. Originally, the film was attached to United Artists, and then it moved to MGM, and then to MGM's British studios. The reason for the switch from a US studio to a British one was largely financial. The projected budget for the film was over $1.5 million, but MGM were only willing to finance $1 million. Wise then realised that although the film is set in the US, filming in Britain would be considerably cheaper, and also by using a British studio, he would benefit from the Eady levy, a tax incentive for filmmakers that we spoke about back in episode 13. Because of the delays, the actors in the frame for the leads shifted several times before arriving at the ones that we see on film. Originally, the role of Eleanor was to be played by Eva Marie Saint, who is probably best known for her roles in On the Waterfront and North by Northwest. Dr. Montague was going to be played by Peter Ustinov, and Luke was originally offered to the actor Richard Beamer, who had played the role of Tony in West Side Story. And then when this did not come to pass, the role was offered to the actor Richard Harris. All of these, I have no doubt, would have given great performances, but it is hard to imagine anyone else in the role of Eleanor as good as Julie Harris. A multi-award-winning stage and screen actress, she brings a desperation and barely controlled hysteria to the role, a character living in the shadow of guilt following her mother's death, one which mirrors the death of Abigail Crane. Her performance was no doubt enhanced by the fact that she was, in reality, suffering from depression at the time, and she channeled this into the character and adopted a method approach. This was a technique that she had developed when she studied as a founding member of the Actors Studio in New York under Lee Strasberg, and Wise would say of her approach, quote, "I've rarely seen an artist who takes a part so seriously. When it came to the first reading, she knew the whole script by heart." End quote. To aid her performance, she deliberately isolated herself from the other actors, and this is something that caused a little on-set conflict with Claire Bloom. Bloom plays Theodora, and she recalled that Harris wouldn't talk to her between takes, and this left her feeling rather hurt, though they resolved this after filming. Russ Tamblyn, who played Luke, said that he found Harris aloof during filming for the same reason. This tension, however, could only have helped the dynamic between the characters of Eleanor and Theo, if not the actresses playing them. Theo is a fashionable artist, with a wardrobe from iconic 1960s designer Mary Quant, who was very well known in the UK at the time, but who had yet to make it in the US. Ridiculously chic and completely unfazed by Mrs. Dudley, Theo is in every way a stark contrast to Eleanor, dark and fashionable compared with pale and prim, confident and forthright compared with insular and repressed. Bloom's performance is incredibly good, one moment flirtatious, another jealous, and another terrified. She also has some terrific one-liners, delivered with a knowing bluntness, courtesy of her extrasensory perception. "Why be mad at me?" she asks. "I don't think you killed your mother." And that's just one example. There is also, of course, a sexual tension between the two, albeit mainly in one direction. Theo is certainly queer-coded. In fact, there was an original scene featuring her and her female partner quarrelling that never made the final version. This was because Wise felt it was too on the nose, and because of issues with the censors, it was decided that Theo's sexuality should be implied and suggested, rather than shown outright. Looking at the film today, it's fair to say that some of the dialogue concerning this is far from subtle, and might certainly raise a few eyebrows with a modern viewer. This is particularly true when Eleanor calls her quote-unquote unnatural, something that, naively, when I was much younger, I thought was just a reference to her psychic abilities. However, just because a character says a line that might be seen as homophobic, it doesn't follow that the movie itself is. And given Eleanor's repression and sheltered, controlled life, one can hardly expect her to be the most liberal and open-minded person. That being said, I think it's safe to say that this really is a woman's movie. Not only are Eleanor and Theo very much at the centre of the action, Bloom and Harris are far more interesting to watch than their male counterparts. No offence to the actors involved. Although Richard Beamer was no longer in the frame to play Luke, the jocular heir to Hill House, the role did end up going to one of his West Side Story co-stars, Russ Tamblyn, who would later go on to play Dr. Jacoby in the David Lynch series Twin Peaks. Not that he was keen to take on the role initially. He recalled not being interested in the script and said that he was very much pressured into taking it by the studio, to whom he was under contract. Of all of the performances in the film, his is the most jarring and also seems very dated, and unfortunately, he provides the one discordant note in the entire movie. The role of the rational scientist, whose name in the movie has been changed to Dr. Markway, went to Richard Johnson, who is now perhaps better known to horror fans for his role in Lucio Fulci's Zombie Flesh Eaters. He was in fact an accomplished stage actor and a key member of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and was once acclaimed as the finest romantic actor of his generation. It was once said of him that, quote, he never became a star, despite producers trying to make him one for a decade, end quote. But it would appear that he certainly had a good time whilst avoiding stardom. He later said in an interview in 2000 that, quote, it comes as a shock to me now to realise that I was making around £1 million a year in today's money, and I managed to spend it all having a hell of a good time. I knew it wasn't going to last forever, and I also knew I had to enjoy it while the time was right. End quote. He portrays a suitably rational and rather paternal character, with the part rewritten slightly to account for his English accent. Markway is certainly passionate about his experiment, but he retains his humanity and is clearly concerned for Eleanor and her fragile mental state. This is in sharp contrast to similar characters in later films, whose quest to prove or disprove the paranormal often turns them into fanatics. Johnson and Bloom are, of course, both British, and their casting was also partly, no doubt, to ensure that the film benefited from the Eady levy. As regular listeners will remember, many films that are set up to benefit from financing and tax loopholes often stipulate that cast and crew have to be predominantly from the country of filming, and The Haunting was no exception to this. As well as Johnson and Bloom, many of the other characters in the film are also British actors, albeit playing with American accents. Markway's wife is played by Lois Maxwell, who went on to play Miss Moneypenny in the James Bond movies of the 1960s and 1970s. Eleanor's rather dreadful sister is played by Diane Clare, who would the following year appear in British horror Witchcraft, and then in 1966 starred as the heroine in the Hammer movie Plague of the Zombies. Mr. Dudley is played by the gravelly-voiced Valentine Dial, while his wife is played incredibly memorably by the British actress Rosalie Crutchley. And I think it's fair to say that Mrs. Dudley absolutely steals the opening of the movie with her fantastic dialogue about no one in town being able to hear you scream in the night and in the dark. This, along with many other lines of dialogue, is taken directly from Shirley Jackson's original novel, and it's a marvellous menacing moment in the film, accompanied with a shark-like smile as she closes the bedroom door. Unfortunately, and rather pointlessly, in my opinion, this line was homaged in the 2018 TV miniseries. But given that Mrs. Dudley in that version is a very benevolent character, all of the menace in the line was removed altogether, and one can't help but wonder why they bothered to keep it in at all. Incidentally, Rosalie Crutchley also appears in a rather good 1973 ghost story called The Return, in which she co-stars with the excellent Peter Vaughan. This can be found on YouTube and is a 30-minute slice of 1970s TV creepiness, and I'll link it in the show notes for anybody who's interested in watching. Filming for The Haunting took place in the UK, with the location of Ettington Park Hotel used for exteriors and the interiors filmed at Boreham Wood Studios. And a special mention here must go to the set designs by Elliot Scott, who uses draperies, statues, mirrors and low-hanging lamps to create a sense of claustrophobia. Between his interiors and the distorting cinematography, it's easy to imagine that one could get lost in Hill House forever, which, as it turns out, of course, poor Eleanor actually does. The Haunting was released in the US on the 18th of September 1963, and it opened to a fairly mixed critical reception. The general consensus was that it was indeed an incredibly stylish film with effective moments, but it had flaws in the plot and overall lacked excitement. And although some audience members were certainly scared by it, others found the ambiguity frustrating, no doubt looking for more explicit thrills than Wise, Gidding and the team were willing to offer. But perhaps the most damning critique of all came from Shirley Jackson herself, who reportedly told her parents that it is actually a very poor movie. The plot of the book changed radically and far too much talk. She later went on to say that the scariest part of the day was the fact that she had been given a parking ticket whilst inside the theatre. Financially, it performed well enough, but it was not a huge success. And I have to say, this was a bit of a surprise to me when I started researching this episode, as its reputation, in hindsight, had me believe that it was a runaway smash. Then again, that's not exactly the first time that that's happened in this series. Over time, though, its reputation grew, and it is now one of the most highly regarded haunted house films ever produced, though there are still those who find its refusal to show anything explicit rather frustrating. And to those people, I would suggest that they watch the Jan de Bont remake and then come back and tell me which one they think is better. In 2018, Mike Flanagan produced his own adaptation of the Shirley Jackson novel, and whilst I enjoyed his version very much at the time, I also think it's fair to say that it bears no relation at all to the source material, and I can't help but wonder why he didn't just call it something else. Don't get me wrong, it is incredibly well made and has some brilliant moments and fantastic performances, but I found elements of it somewhat frustrating. And this was not least because he had the temerity to change Shirley Jackson's quite brilliant closing lines from the novel. Quote, "Hill House itself, not sane, stood against its hills, holding darkness within. It has stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, its walls continued upright. Bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone." End quote. In 1962, Shirley Jackson published her final novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, a heartbreakingly beautiful and tragic Gothic mystery that I personally consider to be her very best work. She died in her sleep in 1965 at her home in North Bennington at the age of just 48. In the final years of her life, she had suffered from numerous health problems. A lifelong heavy smoker, she suffered from asthma, joint pain, exhaustion, and also a suspected heart problem. All of this was no doubt exacerbated by the ignorance of the 1960s medical profession, who prescribed her amphetamines for weight loss and barbiturates for her anxiety and agoraphobia. Of course, at the time, these were considered safe forms of medication, but we now know they exacerbated her health conditions and no doubt contributed to her untimely death. Since then, she has been cited as an influence on a diverse range of authors, including Stephen King, Richard Matheson, Sarah Waters, Joanne Harris, and Nigel Neal. In 2007, with the permission of her estate, the Shirley Jackson Awards were established, and these are awarded for outstanding achievements in literature, of psychological suspense, horror, and the dark fantastic. Following the release of The Haunting, Robert Wise continued his award-winning career. Just 2 years later, in 1965, he directed the musical The Sound of Music, and then in 1966, he directed The Sand Pebbles, an allegory of the Vietnam War which earned Steve McQueen his only Oscar nomination. In 1971, he directed the science fiction thriller The Andromeda Strain, based on the novel by Michael Crichton, and then he followed this with the disaster movie The Hindenburg, the reincarnation horror film Audrey Rose, and Star Trek The Motion Picture, which was the very first feature film in the Star Trek franchise. In the later years of his career, he took on an active role in supporting the film industry and became a governor for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, before becoming its president from 1985 to 1988. He sat on the Board of Trustees of the American Film Institute and was named chairman of the Directors Guild of America's Special Projects Committee in 1980. A 4-time Oscar winner, as well as the recipient of multiple awards, He suffered a heart attack on the 14th of September 2005 and died of heart failure at the UCLA Medical Center 4 days after his 91st birthday. Curse of the Cat People and The Haunting are just 2 films in the legacy of more than 40 movies that Robert Wise directed. In a career spanning over 65 years, he worked across a wide range of genre, film noir to western, musical to science fiction, and of course, horror. Both of this week's films are examples of the quiet ambiguity and subtle terrors that he learned at the hands of the master, Val Lewton, and both films are open to audience interpretation. Is Irina a ghost or simply imaginary? Is Hill House really haunted, or is it all in Eleanor's mind? The influence of both movies, and of Val Lewton, can also clearly be seen in more recent works, such as The Night House by David Bruckner, St. Maud from Rose Glass, and The Blackcoat's Daughter from director Osgood Perkins. So it's reassuring to think that the legacy of Lewton and of Robert Wise lingers on today. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's films or any of the films we've discussed in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. You can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, our Christmas season concludes with 2 very dark comedies set in and around Christmas Eve. First up, we have cult favourite Dead End from 2003, directed by Jean-Baptiste Andrea and Fabrice Capina, and starring Ray Wise, Lynn Shay, Alexandra Holden and Mick Cain. Then we follow that with Day of the Beast from 1995, directed by Alex de la Iglesia and starring Alex Angulo, Armando de Raza, Santiago Seguera and Torelli Pavez. So, if you want to watch along, you can currently rent Dead End from Amazon Prime Video, while Day of the Beast is available to rent on Google Play, Apple TV and Amazon Prime, and is also available to stream on Shudder. And just as a reminder, next week is the last episode in what I have decided to call Season 1 of the Horror Double Bill. So after next week, I'll be taking a break for a couple of weeks, but I'll be back in the new year. And so, for the last time in 2025, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. And until then, thank you once again for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.